Good evening, my friend. Tonight, I invite you to drift backward through time, past the centuries of silence that have settled over marble and ruin, back to the ancient city of Rome, when its streets still glowed beneath oil lamps and its palaces breathed with the heartbeat of an empire that believed itself eternal. For within those marble halls, there once lived a woman whose beauty could still a room, and whose cruelty could make that same room tremble. A woman whose name became both a curse and a fascination whispered across generations. Her name was Valeria Messalina, wife to Emperor Claudius, Empress of Rome, and mistress of everything the world called power. She was not born to rule, yet from the moment her dark eyes opened to the glittering danger of imperial life, she seemed to understand that in Rome the throne did not belong to the man who sat upon it, but to whoever could whisper into his ear. And no whisper could travel deeper than that which came from the Empress's own lips. Messalina was barely 15 years old when she was chosen to marry Claudius, a man nearly 30 years, her senior, a scholar with weak limbs, but a powerful lineage. And when the daggers that struck down the mad Emperor Caligula carved the way for Claudius to ascend in the year 41 A.D., the young girl who had once been nothing more than a decorative bride found herself wearing the crown of Augusta, the mother of the empire, the woman to whom even generals bowed. It was in those first quiet months that she discovered the most dangerous truth of all, that power, when joined with desire, could enslave not only bodies, but entire nations. Within the white corridors of the Palatine Hill, she began to rearrange the empire as if it were her personal stage, replacing loyal servants with those willing to serve her darker ambitions, turning rooms meant for prayer and ceremony into chambers perfumed with incense and laughter that always ended in silence. Senators invited to private dinners found themselves trapped between loyalty and ruin. Young nobles were brought to her under pretexts of promotion, and each man who entered her presence left with the same realization that the Empress knew his secrets, and that resistance would mean destruction not only of his career, but of his honor and his life. The historians of her time, Tacitus, Suetonius, Dio wrote with trembling hands of her talent for turning pleasure into policy and humiliation into government. She recorded everything: names, acts, weaknesses. And with those invisible chains, she pulled the strings of Rome more effectively than any general could have done with legions. But the palace walls were never enough to contain her hunger. When night fell upon the city, Messalina slipped from her golden chambers and disappeared into the streets dressed as a common woman, her hair hidden beneath dark wigs, her face veiled, her footsteps leading to the brothels of the Subura district, where sailors and slaves came seeking relief from labor and hunger. The chroniclers claimed she challenged the prostitutes to contests of endurance, measuring her power, not in coins, but in the number of men she could command. And though later scholars would debate whether the number 25 was literal or symbolic, the meaning was the same, even in the gutters. The Empress of Rome demanded to be the first. To the common people, she became a figure of rumor and fascination, a goddess of sin, who walked among them, while the aristocracy learned to fear her as a force of nature that could not be controlled by shame or by law. As her influence grew, she began to intertwine her pleasures with politics, orchestrating the deaths of those who displeased her with the same ease with which she poured wine. When the senator Valerius Asiaticus owned the gardens she coveted, she accused him of adultery and conspiracy, forcing him to end his life so she could claim the estate. When another nobleman, Silanus, refused her advances, she destroyed him with fabricated charges whispered into her husband's ear until his blood became another offering to her ambition. Even Claudius himself, the emperor who signed decrees and commanded legions, became a prisoner of her charm and her deceit. Historians could never decide whether he was blind, cowardly, or simply too aware that confronting his wife would mean confronting the empire she controlled through terror. Within 7 years, she had built a government of fear, one that began in her bedchamber and reached the farthest provinces through blackmail, favors, and whispered threats. Then, in the year 48 A.D., the story took its final turn. The one that would end with blood staining the marble she had once ruled. For after years of cold calculation, Messalina made the only mistake her kind can ever make. She fell in love. His name was Gaius Silius, a man celebrated for his beauty and his strength, and for reasons that no historian can fully explain. She loved him, not as a tool, but as a man. She forced his wife to divorce him, filled his villa with gold and jewels, and finally, in a spectacle so brazen, it shocked even Rome. She married him while her husband still lived and reigned. The ceremony was not hidden or disguised. Witnesses attended. Sacrifices were offered. The air was filled with music and flowers. And the Empress stood beside her new husband, believing perhaps that she could reshape the empire itself in the image of her own desire. Some said it was treason. Others said it was madness. But the truth is simpler. She believed she could not be touched. News reached Claudius as he inspected grain shipments at the port of Ostia. And when his advisor Narcissus whispered the details of the wedding, something within the emperor finally broke. For the first time in his reign, Claudius acted swiftly. He summoned the Praetorian Guard, rode back to the city, and surrounded Silius's house before the celebration had even ended. The guests were arrested, the lovers separated, and by nightfall Gaius Silius was executed without trial. His head a symbol of the empire's long-delayed vengeance. Messalina fled to the gardens she had stolen years earlier. Those same gardens once watered with another man's death. And there, among the fountains and cypress trees, she waited for the footsteps she could already hear, approaching. Tacitus wrote that she tried to write to her husband, that she begged for mercy, that she even lifted a dagger but lacked the courage to use it. And so when the soldiers arrived, her mother whispered one final plea for dignity before a tribune's blade ended. The reign of Rome's most infamous woman. She was 28 years old when she died, 7 years after she had first become empress. And her death did not cleanse Rome so much as expose its decay. The Senate ordered her statues destroyed, her name erased from marble, her memory condemned by decree. But the people still whispered it. Messalina, the woman who had turned the palace into a brothel and the empire into her stage. They said her laughter could still be heard in the tunnels beneath the Palatine Hill, where torchlight once flickered on silken walls, and the cries of pleasure and pain had mingled into one. And as centuries passed, her legend changed shape, but never vanished, becoming less a story about lust and more a warning about what happens when beauty and power meet without conscience. For even now, as the night falls over the ruins of Rome and the wind sighs through the broken columns, her name still carries the echo of that ancient truth, that the most dangerous empires are not built with armies or laws, but with desire itself. When the night wind carried away the final breath of the Empress, Rome itself seemed to exhale. Yet before that last garden silence, there had been a beginning, a time when Valeria Messalina was not yet a symbol of fear or lust, but a child standing beneath the towering marble of her ancestors' estate, gazing at the world with the soft curiosity of someone who had not yet learned how dangerous beauty could be. She was born into the ancient bloodline of the Valerii, a family that traced its roots back to Augustus himself. And in that lineage, she inherited both privilege and expectation. Servants bowed as she passed. Tutors whispered lessons of rhetoric and philosophy. And at the great feasts of her house, she saw senators speak of virtue, while their eyes betrayed far baser desires. From these scenes, the young girl absorbed her first education, that men who preached restraint often practiced indulgence, and that the world bowed not to morality, but to appearance. It was in this subtle hypocrisy that her mind began to sharpen, learning that to survive in Rome one did not need to be good, only clever. As she grew older, the soft innocence of her youth hardened into something luminous and deliberate. Her beauty was not merely inherited, it was crafted with the precision of an artist. The pale smoothness of her skin, the careful lowering of her lashes, the way her voice could tremble just enough to seem fragile, while concealing the steel beneath all of it, became instruments in a silent symphony of persuasion. When she first walked through the imperial palace as Claudius's new bride, she saw not walls and columns, but a chessboard where each figure breathed. Each move could cost a life, and the prize for victory was absolute power disguised as service. Claudius, gentle and bookish, was perhaps the easiest piece to move. He was a man who studied histories of war but feared confrontation, who sought peace in order and order in obedience. And so when his young wife smiled at him with what appeared to be affection, he mistook strategy for devotion and opened the doors of the empire without knowing it. The first transformation of the palace was quiet. Messalina replaced the older servants with younger ones loyal only to her, dismissed the philosophers who filled the halls with talk of duty, and surrounded herself with poets, dancers, and flatterers whose tongues were sharper than their minds. In the evenings she walked through the corridors barefoot, feeling the cold marble beneath her feet, the sound of her steps echoing like a promise that the empire's heartbeat now belonged to her. When Claudius retired to his scrolls, she sat with his advisors, feigning interest in the administration of provinces and taxes. But what she listened for were names who owed debts, who harbored grudges, who could be swayed by favor or by threat. Knowledge became her first weapon, charm her second, and soon the palace began to hum with her unseen influence. She learned that Rome's greatest power did not lie in its armies, but in its whispers. Within a year, the Empress had mastered the delicate art of transformation, shifting her image to whatever the moment demanded. To the senators' wives, she was grace incarnate, gentle in speech, generous in gifts, a model of Roman virtue. To their husbands, she was temptation, wearing the mask of friendship, offering small favors that grew into obligations. Each encounter, whether in the candlelit intimacy of her private chambers or beneath the painted ceilings of imperial banquets, was a transaction carefully recorded in her memory. She would lower her gaze just enough to suggest humility, and when a man leaned closer to catch her words, she would give him a secret, one chosen to make him feel powerful, and then, when he repeated it elsewhere, she would know how to control him. Step by step, she rewove the threads of loyalty until every strand of the palace tapestry led back to her hand. And yet, there was something in her that reached beyond the calculation of politics, something restless and untamed that no crown could satisfy. The nights were long in Rome, and though she lay beside an emperor, her mind wandered toward the hum of the city below, the scent of oil lamps, the sound of laughter that belonged to those who lived without consequence. It was said that the first time she left the palace in disguise, she walked through the crowded markets of the Subura and felt a strange kind of freedom to be unseen, to be no one, to be desired not as a queen, but as a woman. That night changed her. From then on, her dual life began by day, the Empress who smiled before the Senate; by night, the shadow who slipped into Rome's narrow alleys, seeking proof that she could touch the forbidden and still remain untouchable. The people of the city began to whisper stories. Some called her wicked, others called her divine. To the slaves she was a rumor. To the courtiers, a mirror reflecting their own corruption. And while Rome gossiped, Messalina built her true kingdom, one founded not on marble or armies, but on the fear that she could destroy anyone simply by remembering their sins. Senators who once stood tall now trembled when her messenger appeared. Soldiers who had killed in battle faltered when they met her eyes. Even the priests, whose duty was to guard the sacred, found themselves entangled in her favors. Each act of seduction, each humiliation, each whispered promise became another brick in the invisible fortress she was building around herself. Power came not from commanding respect, but from ensuring that no one dared to withhold it. Still, beneath the silks and jewels, there remained a part of her that understood the danger of her path. And it was this understanding that made her more frightening than madness ever could. She knew that every gesture she made was a performance, that every word was a gamble, and yet she played it with the calm precision of a priestess conducting a ritual. When she looked into the mirror each morning, she no longer saw a woman, but a reflection of Rome itself, beautiful, decaying, unstoppable. She began to speak less to Claudius and more to his freedmen, the administrators and secretaries who managed the empire's daily life, and they learned to fear her tone. For when she smiled, it could mean either fortune or death. Her power grew not in bursts of rebellion, but in the slow, inevitable spread of habit, the way a vine consumes a statue, not by force, but by patience. As the years unfolded, her hold on the empire deepened, and those who once pitied her for being so young began to dread her for being eternal. Foreign envoys brought gifts not to the emperor, but to her, knowing that a single glance from Messalina could determine the fate of their provinces. She had become, in every sense, the pulse of Rome, the invisible will behind its decrees, the quiet command beneath its ceremonies. Yet for all her triumph, there were nights when she would walk alone through the empty corridors and feel a chill that no silk could warm, a whisper in the air, reminding her that power, like desire, is a flame that consumes even as it illuminates. Perhaps she sensed, though she could not admit it, that every empire, even one built from pleasure, must one day meet its ruin. So the girl who had learned to rule through desire stood at the height of her own creation. Her name carried on the breath of every man and every prayer in the capital. Her heart, a labyrinth of secrets she could no longer escape, and the palace, that vast, glittering world of stone and ceremony, had learned to obey not the emperor, but the slow rhythm of her will. Rome slept, and in its sleep, it dreamed her name. The days of Rome moved like a grand procession beneath the Empress's gaze, each sunrise gilding her victories, and each night deepening the shadows that she herself had summoned. And though the empire still bowed before her name, the pulse of something dangerous had begun to tremble beneath the marble floors, something that whispered not of conquest, but of longing. For even the most cunning hearts, no matter how wrapped in gold or deceit, will one day hunger for a touch that is not built on fear. Valeria Messalina had conquered the Senate, the generals, the merchants, and the priests. Yet within her triumph lived a hollow quietness, the silence that follows applause when the performer has nowhere left to bow. And so, from that silence, came the only thing her empire could not provide: desire uncalculated, passion without motive, a love that promised not power, but surrender. It began, as most dangerous things do, in secrecy, in the brief meeting of eyes across a banquet, a look that lingered too long and said what neither dared to speak. Gaius Silius was everything that Claudius was not: young, strong, fearless, and adored by the people. His voice carried through the forum like music, his smile disarming the coldest of hearts. and his bloodline shining with noble heritage. To Rome, he was the image of virtue. But to Messalina, he was something far more intoxicating. He was freedom dressed in human form. Their first conversation, held in the corner of a garden where cypress trees swayed beneath the night breeze, was filled with the formal politeness that both knew was dangerous. Yet behind every word fluttered something that neither politics nor caution could contain. She spoke of art, of poetry, of the emptiness that comes from being adored but never known. And he, perhaps emboldened by the risk, told her that beauty like hers was not meant to be caged in marble halls. That single sentence sealed his fate, for in it she heard not flattery, but rebellion, and rebellion was the only language she still understood. From that evening forward, their meetings became the heartbeat of her nights. Letters written in secret passed between them, each one disguised beneath the seals of imperial business. Yet within their folded parchment lay words that could have burned the empire if ever discovered. He wrote of the scent of her hair, the way the torchlight trembled against her skin, the thrill of touching what the world had declared untouchable. She answered with verses that mixed love and cruelty, promises written like confessions, vows that belonged not to eternity, but to the brief. Dangerous now, the letters were hidden in statues, in vases, in the bindings of scrolls meant for senators, a game of devotion played beneath the eyes of 1,000 spies. And though every message might have meant death, neither stopped writing, for the danger itself became their prayer. The lovers met in secret rooms, carved deep within the palace, chambers known only to Messalina and her most loyal attendants. There, among perfumed lamps and walls, painted with scenes of forgotten gods, she shed not her garments but her crown. In those hours, she was not the empress who bent nations to her will, but a woman who trembled when his hand brushed hers, a soul who, for the first time, was no longer performing. Seleucus, at first fearful, grew intoxicated by her attention. To possess the empress was to hold Rome itself in his arms. Yet with each night came the unspoken dread of dawn. For when the torches burned low, and the echo of footsteps stirred in the corridors, they both knew that the morning could destroy them. Still, they chose to stay, whispering that love was worth the ruin. It promised that the sun could rise as it pleased, for the night belonged to them. Outside those hidden doors, the empire continued its restless dance. Senators gossiped about new decrees. Generals planned campaigns in distant provinces. And Claudius, the emperor whose eyes had learned not to see, remained blind to the storm gathering beneath his own roof. Messalina, more radiant than ever, carried herself through public ceremonies with serenity so perfect it became almost divine. The people adored her. They saw only the empress who smiled at children, who distributed alms, who attended festivals with her husband's arm in hers. But behind that image lived a different truth, that each gesture of kindness was a veil, and behind that veil burned a secret that grew harder to hide with every breath. In her private letters to Silius, she began to speak not only of love, but of destiny. She imagined a future where they could rule together, where Claudius, weakened by age and illness, would simply fade into the silence of history. She had no patience for slow decay. Her nature demanded climax. And Silius, though wary, was drawn deeper into her vision, seduced not by ambition, but by the strange conviction that they had become something larger than themselves, that their love was a force capable of rewriting fate. The more they believed it, the more reckless they became. Messalina arranged feasts where her lover attended, disguised as an honored guest. Their glances across the table too dangerous to be seen and too powerful to be concealed. Even the servants began to notice how the Empress's laughter quickened when Silius entered the room, how her hand lingered too long when passing him a goblet of wine. Rome's most practiced liars began to whisper, and whispers in Rome were the first form of prophecy. At night, when the city grew quiet, Messalina would sit by her window overlooking the gardens and read his latest letter by the light of a single flame. Alcide. The wind stirred the laurel leaves, carrying faint sounds of laughter from the streets below, and she would imagine what it would be like to live without fear, to walk openly beside him through the forum without disguise, to be not empress, but woman. Yet every time she allowed that thought, another followed the image of Claudius, discovering them, the roar of accusation, the swift blade of execution. That terror both haunted and thrilled her, for it reminded her that she was still alive. Power had dulled her senses for years, but love, even forbidden, made her feel human again. In Silius, she found not salvation but reflection, for he, too, lived suspended between desire and doom, and in that balance their hearts beat in unison. As the months passed, their passion transformed into obsession. Messalina could no longer bear the hours apart, the endless charades, the pretense of virtue beside a husband she neither loved nor respected. It was then that she began to imagine the unthinkable, a life where Claudius no longer stood between them. The idea, once whispered only in jest, began to grow roots in her mind, nourished by the wine of her own certainty that she was invincible. For 7 years she had bent Rome to her will. Why should one more act, even treason, to be impossible? The letters turned darker, speaking of omens, of gods who demanded courage, of fate that would never forgive hesitation. Silius, caught between love and reason, hesitated. But the Empress no longer could. She had tasted the kind of love that makes kingdoms seem small, and for that love she was willing to gamble the empire itself. So the lovers, bound by passion and blinded by belief, stood on the edge of an abyss they had built together, unaware that the morning they feared was already approaching. The torches in their secret chambers still burned, the letters still hid beneath statues. But the air had changed. The palace whispered differently now, its corridors carrying rumors that fluttered like wings of vultures. And while they clung to each other in the fragile illusion that love could rewrite destiny, Rome itself was already beginning to write their ending. There are moments in history when reason bends beneath the weight of passion, when those who have ruled by fear suddenly become ruled by desire, and when the same hand that once commanded the empire signs its own ruin. For Valeria Messalina, that moment arrived with the slow inevitability of a storm long seen on the horizon yet ignored until its thunder shattered the sky. Her secret love affair with Gaius Silius had already become the most perilous game in Rome. But what began as stolen letters and hidden embraces began to hunger for more. It was no longer enough to whisper promises in the dark or to imagine a future stolen from the gods. She wanted to make that fantasy flesh, to bind it with ritual, to give it the form of destiny. The Empress, who had spent years turning pleasure into policy, now sought to turn love into law, and in doing so, she would drag the empire itself into the madness of her dream. In the late months of the year, 48 A.D., while the Emperor Claudius oversaw grain shipments at the port of Ostia, Messalina remained in the capital surrounded by courtiers who had long since learned that silence was survival. Yet even the most discreet could not ignore the change in her eyes, the way her voice softened when she spoke of Silius, or how her laughter had grown careless, as though she had forgotten the world still watched. Some said she believed Claudius was on the verge of death, that illness would claim him within the year, and that she could secure the throne by marrying his successor before the crown even fell. Others whispered that she had lost all sense of reason, blinded by the illusion that her beauty could bend fate itself. Whatever truth guided her, it led her to a decision so audacious that even Rome's gods must have held their breath. On a morning heavy with summer heat, Messalina summoned Silius to the palace gardens, where marble fountains murmured like conspirators and the air smelled of myrtle and incense. She spoke to him not as a lover, but as a queen delivering decree, her voice low and deliberate, each word heavy with the certainty of a woman who had never been denied. "Let us be wed," she said, not in secret, but before the eyes of heaven, for love that hides is love that dies. Silius, pale beneath the sunlight, tried to reason, to remind her that such a union would mean open treason, that the Praetorian Guard still swore loyalty to Claudius, and that even the gods themselves might recoil at such blasphemy. But Messalina only smiled, the kind of smile that had undone senators and soldiers alike, and whispered, "The gods have watched me for years, and they have not dared to stop me." Why should they start now? What followed was less a wedding than an act of sacrilege. The villa of Silius, adorned with garlands and draped in silk, became the stage for the most scandalous ceremony in Roman memory. Invitations were sent not in secrecy, but in arrogance, to men and women whose silence could be purchased or whose downfall had already been ensured. Musicians played as if for triumph, dancers performed as if for victory, and the guests, trembling between horror and fascination, watched as the Empress of Rome stood before the altar of Jupiter and placed her hand in that of another man. A priest, either bribed or mad, recited the ancient vows, the same words that had joined generations of noble families. And Messalina, radiant in white, repeated them with a voice that trembled, not with guilt, but with rapture. Wine was poured, sacrifices offered, and the emperor's wife became the emperor's widow in everything but decree. The sun burned high above them, as if the heavens themselves wished to see the moment that would damn them both. When the last echoes of the ceremony faded, Rome itself seemed to hold its breath. Some guests fled that very night, fearing their presence alone would be enough to condemn them. Others stayed, unable to look away from the ruin unfolding before their eyes. Messalina, drunk on the illusion of victory, treated the event as if it were a coronation. She called Silius her husband, addressed him as consul, and spoke openly of their future as rulers of a new Rome cleansed of weakness. In her mind, Claudius was already a shadow, a relic of an age soon to end. Yet even as she feasted among her allies, the walls of her illusion began to crack. For in Rome, nothing remained secret for long, and betrayal was always the first messenger of truth. It was a freedman named Narcissus, once a slave, but now the emperor's most trusted advisor, who first carried the news. He had long despised the empress, watched her corruption with impotent rage, and now saw in her madness the chance to save his master and destroy his enemy. When he arrived at Ostia, where Claudius inspected the cargo of ships, he found the emperor surrounded by courtiers, too terrified to speak. Narcissus approached, his face pale, but his voice steady, and said the words that history would never forget. "My lord, while you oversee the grain of Rome, your wife has wed another." Claudius froze, blinking as though struck blind. "Wed," he repeated, as if the word itself could not exist in the same sentence as her name. "Wed," whom Narcissus leaned closer and whispered, "Silius, my lord." Before witnesses, before priests, before the gods themselves. What followed was silence long, suffocating, and final. Then, with the trembling fury of a man awakening from years of sleep, Claudius Rosa, he who had been mocked as weak, who had tolerated humiliation after humiliation, now moved with the grim resolve of one who had nothing left to lose. Orders flew through the air like arrows. The Praetorian Guard, Rome's most feared soldiers, were summoned to his side. Messengers galloped through the night toward the capital, bearing the imperial seal, and a single command seized all involved, without mercy. Narcissus, sensing the moment, took command in the emperor's name, ensuring that hesitation would not betray them. Rome, which had slept beneath the spell of the empress for 7 years, awoke to the sound of marching boots. Back in the city, the celebrations still echoed through Silius's villa, where laughter mixed with music and the scent of roses still clung to the air. But by dawn, that laughter turned to screams. The guards surrounded the estate, their armor glinting red in the rising sun. Silius, realizing at last that love had become death, attempted neither flight nor defense. He met his end with quiet dignity, his body falling at the threshold, where he had once vowed eternity. The guests, nobles and servants alike, were dragged from their hiding places. Some begged for mercy. Others cursed the empress's name. But mercy was gone from Rome that morning. By noon, executions had begun. Heads rolled upon marble, and the fountains ran crimson beneath the same statues that had witnessed her triumph. And as for Messalina, the woman who had believed herself greater than gods, she fled through the corridors of the palace, her jewels falling behind her like drops of blood, her hair undone, her breath coming in sobs that echoed down the very halls that had once carried her laughter. She sought refuge in the gardens she had stolen years before, the same gardens watered by the tears of those she had destroyed. There, surrounded by silence, she waited, clutching the remnants of her letters to Silius, those fragile ghosts of a love that had consumed her empire. Somewhere far away, Claudius prepared to return, his heart hardened by betrayal, his mind already turning to vengeance. The empire that had worshipped her beauty now whispered her downfall, and thus the wedding that had defied heaven became the funeral song of an empire's innocence. Rome, once proud of its vices, now recoiled from its reflection, and the empress, who had once ruled through desire, found herself facing the cold truth. She had long ignored that every flame, no matter how bright, must one day meet the wind. The morning that dawned over Rome after the wedding was unlike any other, for it rose not upon celebration but upon reckoning, and the same light that once gilded the empress's triumph now revealed the dust of her ruin. Across the city, messengers carried whispers faster than soldiers could march, and before the sun had reached its height, every household from the Subura to the Palatine Hill knew that Valeria Messalina, the Empress of Rome, wife of Claudius, daughter of nobility, the mistress of the empire, had dared to take another husband in the sight of the gods. Some refused to believe it. Others crossed themselves in silent fear. Yet all felt the tremor that such madness unleashed. The empire itself, so vast and unyielding, seemed to hold its breath, as though the marble of its temples remembered that even the greatest walls could fall when built upon desire. And within the villa where the forbidden vows had been spoken, the music had barely faded when the iron sound of the Praetorian Guard began to fill the air like a curse. Messalina awoke that morning to the cries of servants scattering through the halls, their voices sharp with terror, their footsteps echoing the approach of doom. Outside, the golden light of dawn spilled across the gardens she had stolen from the man she once condemned, and for a fleeting heartbeat she stood at the window, watching the cypress trees sway in the same breeze that had witnessed so many of her conspiracies. The perfumes of last night's revel still clung to her hair, the scent of wine and roses heavy on her skin. But the world that had once adored her now seemed suddenly alien, as if Rome itself had turned its face away. She could hear the gates bursting open, the barked orders of soldiers, the clang of armor, and within that chaos, her heart, that instrument of manipulation and power, began to beat in a rhythm she no longer controlled. Fear, true and raw, entered her for the first time in years, and it felt like the return of something long exiled from her soul. They told her that Silius had been captured, that he had not fled, that he had met his death without resistance, and in that moment something inside her broke with a soundless crack. She had loved him not for who he was, but for what he represented: freedom, rebellion, the illusion that she could be something more than the creature she had become. And now even that illusion was gone. The courtiers who once kissed her hands now vanished like smoke. The guards who once stood at her door turned their faces away, and the friends who had feasted at her table scattered into the streets, pretending never to have known her name. Only a few remained: her mother, Domitia Lepida, whose love had survived every disappointment, and a handful of terrified attendants too paralyzed to flee. They urged her to beg for mercy, to throw herself at Claudius's feet before the executioners arrived, to remind him of the years of companionship, of the children they had borne. But Messalina, proud even in despair, could not yet comprehend that her empire had already been stripped from her. She still believed that words, her oldest weapon, might yet save her. Meanwhile, in the emperor's camp near Ostia, Claudius sat in his litter, surrounded by silence, broken only by the sound of the sea. He had wept, not for love, but for humiliation, for the knowledge that all of Rome had witnessed his shame before he himself had known it. The freedman Narcissus, whose cunning had long been underestimated, stood at his side and spoke softly, reminding him that mercy for such betrayal would be weakness, that the empire demanded blood to cleanse its honor. Claudius, exhausted and trembling, gave a single nod, and with that gesture, the fate of the Empress was sealed. Orders were dispatched ahead of his return. She was to die before he could be tempted to forgive her. For in his heart, some part of him still faltered, still remembered the laughter that had once filled their chambers, still saw the face of the young bride who had smiled at him so many years before. Narcissus knew that hesitation could undo everything, and so he moved swiftly, guiding the hand of vengeance before remorse could take root. By the time Claudius's chariot entered the city gates, the imperial guard had already surrounded the gardens of Lucullus. The soldiers advanced through paths lined with fountains and marble statues that seemed to watch with stone eyes as justice approached. Within the central courtyard, Messalina waited beneath a colonnade, her white gown stained with dust, her hair unbound, her hands clutching a scroll she had written in trembling desperation, a letter meant for Claudius, filled with pleas and half-remembered endearments, the final performance of a woman who had built her life upon persuasion. Her mother knelt beside her, whispering prayers to gods who had long ceased to listen, urging her daughter to die with dignity, to meet the end as a Roman should. But dignity was a luxury the Empress no longer possessed. She who had ruled the world could not even rule her own trembling hands. When the tribune of the guard entered, his face expressionless beneath his helmet, she tried to rise, but her knees betrayed her. The scroll slipped from her grasp, falling into the dust, the words of forgiveness unread. The tribune gave her one chance, the chance to take her own life. It was an ancient mercy, a courtesy granted to those of noble blood. But even now, courage deserted her. She took the dagger, stared at it as though it were some alien object, and pressed its point against her skin. Yet her hand refused to move. She had watched Mendi by her command, had listened to the screams of others with unflinching eyes. But when the moment came for her own blood to be spilled, she could not summon the strength. Her mother, her last witness and final conscience, turned away in grief, whispering, "Do not let them take your dignity from you, die, before they make you small." But the Empress, once feared by all, now knelt like a child, lost in her own creation, her lips moving soundlessly, perhaps praying, perhaps begging the silence to undo what time had already sealed. Seeing her hesitation, the tribune hesitated too, torn between duty and pity. Yet duty won. With a swift motion, the blade descended, and the life of Valeria Messalina ended as swiftly as a candle's flame vanishing in the wind. When Claudius was informed that she was dead, he did not speak. For a long while, he simply stared at the messenger, as though the words themselves were in a language he could not understand. Then, turning away, he asked for wine and muttered, "The Empress should have dined with us tonight." Those who heard him later said it was not forgetfulness, but shock. The emptiness left behind when love and hatred die together. In the days that followed, her statues were torn down, her name erased from inscriptions, her likeness chiseled from marble as though she had never existed. The Senate decreed a damnatio memoriae, a condemnation of memory forbidding her name to be spoken in reverence or her image to be restored. Yet even as chisels struck stone, the city continued to whisper. Servants told stories of the hidden chambers beneath the palace, of the silk curtains that still moved without wind, of laughter that lingered in the night. Rome could erase her face, but not her shadow. And so it was that the woman who once ruled the empire through pleasure met her end in silence, her body laid to rest in an unmarked tomb, her power dissolved like perfume in the air. But the mark she left upon Rome could not be buried. For every senator who had bowed to her, every wife who had cursed her name, every slave who had heard the faint music of her secret feasts, carried a memory that time could not cleanse. In the years that followed, her story became a whisper of warning, a tale told to daughters and courtiers alike that even beauty, when wed to power, may lead not to glory, but to oblivion. And as dusk fell upon the gardens of Lucullus, the fountains still murmured softly, as if repeating her name beneath their breath, the name that Rome had tried so hard to forget but never could. When the blade fell and silence reclaimed the gardens, Rome believed it had cleansed itself of sin. The Empress was gone, her blood absorbed by the very soil that had once borne her footsteps, her body hidden from public view, her name struck from every record, every monument, every coin that had once carried her likeness. But cities, like people, do not forget so easily. Beneath the roar of its marketplaces and the songs of its soldiers, Rome carried a memory it could not bury, a whisper that grew louder in the quiet hours between dusk and dawn. For the empire might erase the letters carved into stone, but it could not erase the echo of a woman who had ruled it through desire, nor the shame of an emperor who had loved her too long. And so, while Claudius resumed his duties, pretending the storm had passed, the air of Rome thickened with unease, as if the very gods were reluctant to look upon what had been done in their name. In the weeks that followed her death, the palace on the Palatine Hill stood shrouded, in strange quiet. The chambers that had once glowed with torchlight and laughter now smelled faintly of smoke and fear. The servants walked softly, their eyes lowered, as though afraid her ghost might step from behind one of the marble pillars. At night, guards whispered that they heard footsteps in the corridors, the soft rustle of silk, the faint perfume of jasmine that had always preceded her arrival. Some claimed to have seen her shadow crossing the courtyard when the moon was full, her face pale as the marble of her own statues. her eyes fixed on something no living soul could see. It did not matter whether these tales were true or born of guilt. They spread through the city like smoke, winding their way from the servants' quarters to the taverns, from the taverns to the temples, until Rome itself began to tremble with superstition. People said the Empress's spirit wandered the palace she had once ruled, searching not for vengeance, but for remembrance, for the voice that had dared to erase her. Claudius, who had once been mocked for his frailty, now carried himself with the hollow dignity of a man who has lost too much to ever feel whole again. He ruled efficiently, perhaps even wisely, yet every decree he signed bore the invisible weight of her absence. At feasts, when courtiers toasted his health, his eyes would drift toward the empty chair beside him, and his lips would tighten with the faintest shadow of sorrow. He forbade anyone to speak her name. But sometimes, late at night, when his attendants believed him asleep, they would hear him murmuring to the darkness, asking questions that had no answer. Had she loved him once? Or had it all been lies? Had she been born wicked? Or had Rome made her so? And when dawn came, he would rise with the same weary composure, as though each night's confession had been erased by duty. But memory is a stubborn thing. Even as the emperor sought to rebuild his image, the stories of Messalina began to twist and multiply. The common people, who had once adored her for her beauty, now spoke of her as a demon. A caution whispered to young women about vanity and temptation. Poets turned her name into metaphor, the embodiment of excess and corruption, while playwrights wove thinly veiled versions of her story into tragedies performed before audiences who gasped and laughed at what they pretended to forget. Yet beneath the moralizing and the mockery lay fascination. For the Romans, who prided themselves on discipline and reason, could not resist a woman who had defied both. They cursed her with their words, even as they worshipped her with their imagination. And so, paradoxically, the more Rome tried to silence her, the more alive she became in its collective mind. The senators who had survived her rule carried scars deeper than any soldier's wound. Some had lost sons to her whims, others, fortunes, others, simply peace of mind. Yet even among them, there were those who spoke of her with reluctant admiration. She ruled without an army. One was heard to say, "And that is the rarest power of all." They remembered the way she could command a room without raising her voice. How a single glance could make the proudest men falter. How, even in disgrace, she had refused to weep before them. To some, she remained the embodiment of Rome itself, magnificent, corrupt, immortal. To others, she was proof that the gods themselves delighted in reminding mortals how fragile they truly were. In the Subura, where her nighttime wanderings had once been legend, her story became myth. Prostitutes whispered prayers to her before taking clients, calling her Domina Umbrae, the mistress of shadows, asking that she grant them charm and survival in a world ruled by men's whims. They claimed that on certain nights, when the moon hung low and the alleys smelled of rain, a woman in a white veil would appear at the door of the oldest brothel, her face hidden, her hands cold as marble. She would leave a coin on the threshold, stamped not with any emperor's face, but with a serpent, the old Roman symbol of rebirth, and by morning, the coin would vanish, as though melted into air. Whether this was superstition or secret rebellion, no one knew, but it made the people whisper her name again, quietly, defiantly, keeping alive what the empire had sworn to destroy. Years passed, and Claudius remarried, this time to his niece Agrippina, a woman as cunning as she was patient. She studied the story of Messalina like a scholar studying a warning. learning from her predecessor's downfall, and ensuring that her own ambition would wear the mask of virtue. Rome watched as one empress replaced another, as one shadow faded into the next, and yet beneath it all, Messalina's ghost seemed to linger, not in body, but in consequence. Her reign had exposed something the empire could never unsee: that power, once tasted, could never again be contained by tradition. Women who had once lived in silence began to move differently in her aftermath, aware that even ruin could make a name eternal. When scholars of later generations sought to write of her, they found themselves torn between disgust and fascination. The moralists painted her as the symbol of decadence, the ultimate warning of what happens when virtue collapses under pleasure. The poets, however, described her as a flame destructive. Yes, but luminous. And as the centuries passed, she transformed again and again, from sinner to symbol, from tyrant to myth, until the boundaries between truth and invention dissolved. Her name survived the emperors who condemned her, survived the wars that burned her city, survived even the passing of Rome itself, long after her bones had turned to dust. Her story still walked the world, a reminder that those who seek to erase memory only feed it with power. Sometimes, when the wind moved through the ruins of the Palatine Hill, travelers claimed to hear faint laughter rising from beneath the stones. Perhaps it was imagination, perhaps nothing more than the echo of history refusing to fade. But for those who listened closely, it sounded almost like a whisper, not of sorrow, but of defiance, as though the woman who had once ruled through desire still walked among her ruins, reminding the living that she had never truly died. For in the end, a name erased from marble may yet live forever in the human heart. And Valeria Messalina, Empress of Rome, would not be forgotten, not by the empire that condemned her, nor by the centuries that followed, nor by the countless souls who still dream of power, of beauty, and of the perilous price they demand. In the quiet years that followed her death, the empire tried to convince itself that the memory of Valeria Messalina had vanished with her final breath. Yet within the walls of the palace, her shadow remained, not in whispers this time, but in the living flesh of her children. They were young when she died, too young to understand the enormity of their mother's downfall, too innocent to grasp that their names, once symbols of honor, had become stains, whispered with caution in the corridors of power. Octavia, the daughter who had inherited her mother's grace, but not her hunger, grew beneath the careful eyes of tutors who taught her restraint before compassion, silence before truth. Britannicus, the son born to inherit an empire, carried in his features the faint echo of both his parents, the sharp intelligence of Claudius, and the haunting beauty of the woman the Senate had damned. Yet for all their lineage, they lived as prisoners of a legacy they did not choose. Each day, a rehearsal in caution. Each word weighed before it left their lips. The empire that had once bowed before their mother now looked upon them as reminders of everything it wanted to forget. Claudius, their father, tried, in his own weary way, to shield them from that judgment. But even emperors cannot protect children from memory. He visited them less often as time went on, not from cruelty, but from a grief that made every glance at them an act of pain. When he looked upon Britannicus, he saw the promise of a dynasty. When he looked upon Octavia, he saw the ghost of her mother, her eyes too knowing, her smile too fragile. He told his advisors that the past was dead, but in the solitude of his chambers he knew better. Every decision he made seemed to echo against the mistakes he had failed to prevent. And so he ruled with diligence, but without joy. His heart divided between the empire he sustained and the private sorrow that haunted him until his last days. For Rome, the reign of Claudius, after Messalina's death, was a strange mixture of recovery and denial. The Senate reclaimed its dignity. The temples were cleansed, and public morality was paraded through the streets as though virtue could be restored by decree. Yet behind the facade of stability, there was unease, the sense that the empire had glimpsed something irreparable, that the poison of indulgence still lingered beneath the surface. It was in this fragile balance that Agrippina arrived, the emperor's niece, who would soon become his new wife and queen. She came cloaked not in silk and perfume as Messalina once had, but in composure and restraint, a woman who understood that power gained through scandal was power that could not endure. Agrippina studied the ghosts of the palace the way a general studies old battlefields. She learned from every misstep of the woman who came before her, and with a cold brilliance, she began to rebuild what Messalina had burned. Octavia and Britannicus found themselves caught in her web of charm and discipline. She treated them with gentleness that felt rehearsed, with affection that never quite reached her eyes. To the public, she became the image of maternal virtue. Yet those who lived within the palace walls knew that her kindness was strategy, and her gaze, though soft, was that of a hawk circling prey. She ensured that the children of Messalina would never again pose a threat to her ambitions. Octavia she molded into quiet obedience, preparing her for a marriage that would serve the empire rather than her own heart. Britannicus she tolerated at first as the rightful heir, while she moved silently to elevate her own son, the boy Nero, above him. It was a cruel symmetry, as though the sins of one mother were being rewritten by another. Different in method but not in purpose, the palace, which had once been a theatre of lust and indulgence, now became one of calculation and control. Octavia grew into a woman of poise and restraint, her beauty subdued by sorrow. She had inherited her mother's grace, but none of her daring. The fire that once blazed in Messalina's eyes had cooled to quiet embers in hers. Those who saw her walking through the gardens sometimes said she looked like a statue come to life, beautiful but distant, as if she carried within her the weight of all that had come before. Britannicus, meanwhile, grew strong in spirit, but every step he took toward his destiny was met with invisible resistance. Advisors who once pledged loyalty to his father now avoided his gaze. Allies vanished without explanation. He began to sense that the walls themselves had turned against him, that every corridor whispered not of his future, but of his inevitable fall. He confided in Octavia, who told him in trembling voice that survival in Rome meant forgetting one's blood. "We are our mother's children," she said, "and that is something Rome will never forgive." As the years passed, Agrippina's influence deepened. She stood beside Claudius at the Senate, her presence regal, her voice measured, her smile never betraying the thoughts that turned behind it. To the people, she was redemption, made flesh, a second empress who promised to restore the honor that Messalina had defiled. But in her heart, she knew that redemption was only a disguise for ambition. She fed Claudius carefully chosen words, reminding him that the empire needed stability, that her son Nero, though young, possessed the temperament of a ruler, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, Claudius began to distance himself from his own blood, not out of hatred, but from weariness, from the desire to believe that the empire could begin anew. Then, in the autumn of his final year, as the leaves turned gold over the Tiber, Claudius fell ill after a banquet. The physicians said it was fever. The servants whispered of poison, and Agrippina wept with a grace too practiced to be believed. When he died, Rome mourned him as a scholar, a builder, and a just ruler. But those within the palace knew that his death had not merely ended a reign, it had completed a cycle. For with Claudius buried, the children of Messalina stood defenseless, and the empire once again belonged to a woman who ruled behind the throne. Agrippina placed the laurel wreath upon the head of her son Nero, declaring him emperor before the Senate could question her authority, and Octavia, daughter of the condemned, became his bride. Her fate sealed not by choice but by lineage. Britannicus, once heir to the world, was reduced to a shadow. He walked the same marble floors his mother once ruled, yet every step brought him closer to the silence that had claimed her. The courtiers avoided his gaze, the guards no longer bowed, and even the servants spoke his name, only in whispers. On a winter's night, not long after Nero's coronation, he dined with his family for the last time. A cup of wine was placed before him, and as he lifted it, he felt a chill, unlike any he had ever known. They said he died peacefully, that his heart simply failed. But those who stood nearby swore that Agrippina's smile did not falter when his body went still. In that moment, the ghost of Messalina was avenged and defeated all at once. Her children, the last remnants of her name, had been erased as surely as her statues. And yet, just as before, Rome could not forget. The people began to murmur that the curse of the Empress had returned, that every woman who dared to rule in shadows would meet the same fate, that every emperor who silenced love for power would one day hear her laughter in his dreams. Her story had become prophecy of her memory, immortal not because Rome wanted it, but because it feared what it revealed. And as the torches burned low in the imperial palace, Octavia's quiet eyes reflected the same melancholy moonlight that had once glimmered upon her mother's final night. The empire had buried the woman who brought it to its knees, but it could not bury the truth that she had taught it, that even the greatest thrones rest upon the trembling heart of a single mortal soul, and that when that heart breaks, an empire may fall with it. Rome did not fall in a single night, nor in a single generation. It decayed in whispers, in dinners where poison tasted like wine, in corridors where love was only a weapon, and in thrones that passed from one trembling hand to another, each colder than the last. After the death of Britannicus, the empire seemed to sigh as though exhausted by its own cruelty, and the shadow of Valeria Messalina, long buried beneath marble decrees, and the lies of history began once more to stir. For even those who condemned her had inherited her legacy. The art of deceit had become the language of survival, and every empress who followed her wore her ghost like an invisible crown. Agrippina, who now ruled beside her son Nero, believed herself wiser than the woman she had replaced, certain that she could wield power without falling into scandal. Yet Rome, ever the patient observer, had seen too much to believe in innocence. It had watched one empress die in the arms of her lover, and another smile beside her poisoned husband. It had learned that beneath the silk of queenship, there always lurked ambition waiting to strike. Agrippina understood this, and in her cold understanding, she built her strength upon silence. She never raised her voice, never displayed affection that could be mistaken for weakness, never allowed her name to echo too loudly beyond the emperor's ear. She was the reflection of Messalina inverted, where passion once ruled, calculation now reigned. Yet those who saw her pass through the marble halls with her measured grace whispered that even she could not escape the curse of the former empress, that she had learned her lessons too well, that every look she gave carried the weight of suspicion. She had not destroyed Messalina's ghost, she had absorbed it. And in the way her eyes followed Nero, in the way she directed the empire through counsel disguised as motherly concern, one could sense that the same invisible thread that had guided the hands of her predecessor now guided hers. Rome once again had a woman who ruled from behind the throne, and the city's heartbeat grew heavier beneath her will. Nero, still young, was a strange mirror to the chaos that had birthed him. In the early years of his reign, he was adored, called the Golden Youth of Rome. A putking, a musician whose touch upon the lyre could bring tears to even the most hardened of soldiers. Yet beneath the beauty of his art, there burned the same fire that had consumed Messalina. The desire to be worshipped, not for duty, but for self. The blood that flowed through his veins carried the memory of women who had ruled not by law but by passion. And the empire soon felt the return of that dangerous rhythm, the slow, seductive decay that begins not in the streets but in the heart of the palace. Agrippina saw it before anyone else. She had worked too hard to build this empire of ashes, to see it crumble at the hands of her son's vanity. She warned him of excess, counseled him to temper his desires. But in her caution, Nero heard only reproach. In her guidance, only control, and in her silence, only judgment. And thus, the same thread that had bound mother and child since the dawn of empires began once more to tighten around the neck of its ruler. Rome, ever hungry for spectacle, watched as the drama unfolded like a play written by the gods themselves. Agrippina, once untouchable, began to sense the shifting of loyalty around her. The same courtiers who had flattered Messalina in her glory now whispered new songs to Nero, praising his independence, his genius, his divinity. The Senate, weary of strong women, rejoiced quietly in the sight of a son turning against his mother. And in the corners of the palace where lamps burned low, servants began to speak of omens, mirrors cracking without cause, doves found dead on the steps of temples, and in the garden pools, reflections that showed faces no longer living. Agrippina dismissed them as superstition. Yet in her dreams she saw Messalina's eyes calm, unblinking, pitiless, and she would wake with the feeling that the dead were not gone but watching, waiting for Rome to repeat its sins. It was perhaps inevitable that Nero, like Claudius before him, would seek freedom from the woman who had made him emperor. He began to distance himself from Agrippina, surrounding himself with flatterers who told him that his mother's caution stifled his greatness. Soon, whispers turned to plots. Agrippina's power, once built on intellect and fear, began to crumble under the weight of her own success. The people who owed her everything now avoided her, just as they had avoided Messalina in her final hours. Rome's memory is cruel, and though it had condemned one woman for lust and the other for ambition, it found in both the same threat, a woman too near the throne. Nero, drunk on youth and music, decided that his empire could bear only one star. And so, he ordered her death. Not in public, where Rome might protest, but in the quiet secrecy that had always been the empire's most faithful assassin. When the deed was done, when Agrippina's ship was sunk beneath the dark waves of Baiae and her body dragged to shore, the courtiers whispered that the cycle was complete. The empress who had learned from ghosts had become one herself. Nero, triumphant and trembling, walked through his palace that night, as though haunted by invisible footsteps. He had destroyed the last woman who could command him. Yet in the silence that followed, he heard something else, laughter faint as wind, the same laughter that Rome had once attributed to Messalina. It drifted through the corridors like perfume, mocking, endless, eternal. And so, the empire of ashes continued. The thrones changed, the faces changed, but the curse remained. Every emperor who sat upon that marble seat looked upon the same city, the same restless heart that had once belonged to a woman too powerful to forget. Century la terre? When the historians of Rome tried to make sense of these years, they wrote not of policies or wars, but of personalities of the way power and desire danced together until they were indistinguishable. They spoke of Messalina, of Agrippina, of Nero, as though they were figures in a tragic epic rather than flesh and blood. And in a way, they were, for Rome itself had become the stage, its citizens the audience, its rulers, the actors repeating lines written by fate long before their births. In the ruins that remained after the flames of Nero's madness finally consumed the city, travelers would sometimes find fragments of statues, faces worn smooth by time. One such fragment, discovered centuries later, bore a faint inscription half erased by chisels, only a few letters visible. Selena. Scholars debated whether it was hers, the forbidden name the Senate had condemned, or merely coincidence. Yet those who stood before it said that even in ruin, the stone seemed to hold a strange serenity, as though the woman it once depicted had made peace with her legend. Perhaps she had, for though the empire that had feared her had long since turned to dust, her story endured, whispered through generations like a secret prayer. Rome, in the end, was a mirror of the women who had ruled it brilliant, cruel, unrepentant. It rose in splendor, burned in passion, and lived forever in the tension between glory and decay. And as the centuries passed, as kingdoms rose and fell, the name of Valeria Messalina continued to shimmer faintly beneath the dust of time, no longer a symbol of shame, but a reminder of the eternal truth she had embodied. That power, once touched by human desire, can never again return to innocence. And in that truth lay Rome itself, the empire of ashes, still breathing beneath the weight of its own memories, still haunted by the woman who had once dared to make it hers. The centuries drifted forward, and yet the dust of Rome never truly settled. For even as empires rose upon the bones of its greatness, the story of Valeria Messalina continued to breathe beneath the ruins, carried by the murmurs of scholars, the songs of poets, and the restless dreams of those who gazed too long upon the crumbling palaces where her footsteps once echoed. Time had softened the cruelty of her deeds, blurring the boundaries between truth and legend, until the woman who once terrified the Senate became a symbol of something deeper and more haunting: the eternal hunger of power, the frailty of those who hold it, and the strange, tragic beauty of those who dare to challenge the order of the world. Rome had tried to bury her beneath shame, to erase her name from every record. Yet the more it tried to silence her, the more indelible she became. For memory, like flame, cannot be extinguished by decree. It can only be reshaped by those who dare to remember. Long after her death, generations of Roman historians would wrestle with her ghost. Some called her a monster of indulgence, others a victim of circumstance. The moralists condemned her as the downfall of virtue. The philosophers used her as a warning, and the poets, those eternal lovers of tragedy, turned her into an emblem of forbidden splendor, a woman who burned too brightly for the fragile world that tried to contain her. Plays were written where she spoke from beyond the grave, defending herself against men who had called her unholy. Painters centuries later would capture her image on canvas pale, luminous, draped in silk, her eyes neither guilty nor innocent, but aware, as though gazing at the viewer with the quiet knowledge that history itself had become her accomplice. And in every portrayal, whether made in fear or fascination, one truth endured: no one could speak of the Roman Empire without whispering her name. Even the stones seemed unwilling to let her go. When archaeologists uncovered the hidden passages beneath the Palatine Hill, they found chambers carved with frescoes, faded by time, faces of women reclining among vines, painted in colors that had once glowed with life. Some believed these rooms had belonged to Messalina, that these walls had witnessed her revels, her plots, her triumph. Others said they were older still, remnants of forgotten rituals that predated her birth. Yet when the torchlight flickered across the damp surfaces, it was easy to imagine her presence there, the rustle of her gown, the glint of a jeweled hand, the faint scent of myrrh that had not touched the air in 2,000 years. History and imagination merged, until no one could tell where the past ended and the legend began. And perhaps that was the true punishment Rome had never intended, that her name, meant to be erased, became immortal. Her enemies had destroyed her body, her memory, her monuments. But in doing so, they had turned her into something greater than a woman, a mirror in which all who held power could see themselves reflected, stripped of illusion, for every ruler who came after her, from emperors to kings, from conquerors to queens, carried within them some echo of her story. The hunger for control, the fear of betrayal, the dance between desire and destruction, these were not Messalina's alone. They were the nature of empire itself. She had simply lived them too vividly, too honestly, for her world to forgive. It is said that centuries later, when the empire had fallen and the city lay quiet beneath the weight of ruin, pilgrims who wandered the forum at dusk claimed to hear music drifting from beneath the stones, a faint echo of flutes and laughter, as if the palaces of old had begun to remember themselves. They would pause, listening to the rhythm of wind moving through arches, and for a fleeting moment, they would believe they could hear her voice low, rich, carrying that same paradox of allure and defiance. Some called it superstition, others madness. But perhaps it was only the echo of what Rome had always been, a city that refused to let its sins sleep. As the centuries turned into millennia, her story travelled far beyond the Tiber. In the monasteries of the Middle Ages, monks copied the writings of Tacitus by candlelight, their pens scratching against parchment, their faces pale in the flickering glow. When they reached her name, they paused, some crossing themselves before writing it, others whispering prayers as if her ghost might emerge from the ink. In their careful Latin, they condemned her, but even as they did, they ensured her survival. For each word copied was another breath granted, another thread tying her to the living world. In time, her name crossed languages and borders, finding new life in the courts of Europe, where queens and courtiers invoked her as both caution and inspiration. Artists painted her in jewels and shadows. Dramatists gave her speeches that no emperor could silence. And philosophers debated whether she was evil or merely free. Every age reshaped her to reflect its own fears, its own desires, its own hidden mirror of the human heart. And thus, what began as scandal became something sacred in its endurance. Messalina's story outlasted the empire that condemned her, the religion that replaced it, the centuries that sought to moralize her into submission. She became not merely a woman of history, but a force of memory, a symbol of what happens when humanity reaches too far beyond its own limits. In her defiance, there was beauty. In her downfall, there was revelation. She was the eternal whisper that power demands a price, and that the heart, once corrupted by ambition or desire, cannot distinguish between victory and ruin. Even now, when travelers stand upon the ruins of Rome and watch the sunlight fade across the ancient stones, they feel something stir, not fear, but recognition. For Messalina's tragedy was never truly hers alone. It was the tragedy of civilization itself, the endless cycle of creation and decay, of hunger and consequence. The emperors who followed her repeated her story in different guises, their sins dressed in new robes, their names carved into monuments that time would also erase. Yet her legend endured precisely because it was not confined to an age or a name. It was the reflection of all who dream of power, of all who mistake desire for destiny, of all who learn too late that both can destroy. As night descends over the Palatine Hill, the air grows cool, the shadows stretch long, and the last traces of sunlight brush against the broken columns where once stood the heart of an empire. Somewhere beneath those stones, beneath the layers of earth and memory, lies the unmarked grave of the woman Rome tried to forget. Perhaps her bones have turned to dust. Perhaps the soil itself has swallowed her story whole. But still, her spirit moves through the corridors of history, whispering the same eternal truth that power, when unrestrained by conscience, always becomes its own undoing. And if one listens closely in the silence between the wind and the stones, one might almost hear her voice calm, unbroken, ageless, saying what Rome never dared to believe, that she, Valeria Messalina, was never just an empress of flesh and blood, but the embodiment of the empire's own reflection, the part of its soul it could never cleanse, the lesson time could never erase. And so, as the stars bloom over the sleeping city and the Tiber glimmers with the light of distant fires, her story drifts once more into the air, not as accusation, not as legend, but as memory eternal, reminding every age that power without mercy is a crown of thorns, that beauty without restraint is a weapon, and that even in death, the voice of one woman can outlive the empires of men.